Boom, boom, boom. All right. I'm on the screen for the third time today. It's kind of crazy. How you doing, man?
I'm good there. Oh, can I talk? Oh, I thought it was like timed either way. I'm very well,
No,
thanks. Yeah.
welcome to freeform land, right? Which is how I like to do them when I'm not in a tournament. And
Exciting.
unless I think I'm going to go crazy on my opponent, and then I do it for their own protection.
All right. Hopefully that won't be needed today.
Yeah, I don't think so. All right, so this is a topic where I'm not keen to prove to anyone that this is the best idea. It's more something I want to talk about, and in a critical format, try to hash out what's good and bad. So I'm going to present some of the things I think are a problem, and I'm sure you'll come up with some challenges that I haven't thought of though. So I think that's good. Or maybe I'll save what I think are challenges if you miss them.
Yeah.
Then I'll bring them up. So let's do it that way. I think it's more fun. All right. So here's the general proposal, right? The general idea is that you, as an individual citizen of the country, I'm using the United States as an example, want to give money to the government in some fashion. So let's say I like the space program. I'm going to donate $500 to my space program. I get a receipt back that says I donated $500 or gave $500, however you want to say it. Then when it comes time for me to do my taxes, I've got this receipt. I can pay $500 less in tax. We call that a tax credit in the U.S., right? So it's a direct one-for-one reduction of what you pay. So the idea here, generally idea, is I get to funnel my tax money or some portion of it at parts of the government that I want to prioritize expenditures in. The reason that the main impetus is in this country, people are always moaning that their tax money is going to things that they don't like, right? So they're like, I don't want to fund abortion, so my taxation is theft because it's not going where I want. And other people are like, I don't want to fund the military because they kill people in Afghanistan, right? So the general impetus behind this idea for me is that, right? It's like, look, okay, tell you what, you send your money to not Afghanistan, but send it over to to the CDC or something, Center for Disease Control, if you think that's important. You love the military, great. Send your money to the military, cool. Now, both those things are getting funded, but you guys aren't feeling like you're getting your arm twisted to funding things you don't like, right? But we still have all these things happening, right? So that's kind of the impetus for this. I would definitely, from a practical standpoint, not just say, like, you stop the way you're doing taxes and you suddenly start doing this. This would be either something you could do when you're starting a new nation, rarely happens, but whatever, or you could phase in over time. So you would start with a pilot program. Let's say you slash the budget in the U.S. of every department by 5%. That's not legal entitlement where, people pay money in and money goes out and it's required. But everything that's discretionary in the budget gets a 5% cut. Everybody in the country is allowed to allocate 5% of their money through these donations or direct payments to government agencies. They get the receipts, and at tax time, they get to deduct them. The government agencies, of course, would probably be lobbying for money. They're like, we want the lion's share of this. So they're going to be communicating with the public, saying we're a really valuable service. You should definitely support our agency, etc. Independent political groups, kind of like parties, but they could be done by anybody, would probably set together to create package funds. So this is like the American Progressive Fund. And if you give your 5% here, we'll make sure it is wisely distributed to the areas of the government we think should be put forward. If it's the libertarians, they could do the Libertarian Fund. I could give my money to them. They would channel this money only to things that they think are those essential parts of government that libertarians support, et cetera, et cetera. They would not be able to take any of the money that they're channeling to the government for themselves. They'd have to be funded either by membership or just their own interests in that political ideology. You try it out for a certain number of years, say 4 to 6 years, see what happens. If it works out pretty nicely, you can do more of it. If it works out terribly, you should stop, because I'm a pragmatist. I feel you should do things that work and don't do things that don't work. So here's the possible benefits I see that I think are kind of interesting. And again, geared towards American politics, but we could discuss other nations as well. So people have more say in where their money goes and a more direct say in government. So it's more democratic in that sense than what we have now, where other people make those decisions for you. People don't feel like they're forced to support programs that they don't want with their tax money. So talk about that. Politicians are in control of less money, and thus there's less opportunity for corruption. because you don't have that thing where the military is going to new Joint Strike Fighter, and so they're going to make sure some money is going to go into senator's home state and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't happen. If anything, these government contracts are going to be bribing the public directly, and hey, well, that's not necessarily such a bad thing. You might actually get better decision making because of the power of collective imagination and collective thinking. Some interesting experiments done where, let's say you have like a jar of pennies and you're trying to count how many pennies are in there. They have those at fairs a lot. It's really interesting. Any individual person is probably going to have a terrible guess, but actually, if you take the average of like 1,000 people guessing how many pennies, they can be an incredibly accurate number. It's pretty impressive how kind of group perspective can actually make cohesive positions that are really very accurate just due to that. You're getting a huge perspective and it's all getting mathematically accumulated. So there's that potential advantage. Congress gets to focus a lot more on the job of adjudicating law, like what's legal and what's illegal, what kind of restrictions there should be on businesses, and less time dickering over which parts of the government should get money or not get money and what those priorities are. So you get a more functional Congress that way. There's less chance of government shutdowns because right now in America, you get every year, these battles over where we're going to shut down the government if you don't give us our program money over here, and it's always about the budget. So if this system was carried to its logical end, that would never happen. People would just put their money wherever they put their money. There would be no threat of a shutdown because everybody gets to make an individual choice with all the money. It just gets decided automatically that way. That wouldn't happen with the 5%, but this is kind of a long-term goal. And let's see, it includes a kind of built-in compromise that doesn't require a consensus position on budget issues. So right now, the congressmen have to wrangle back and forth, try to make some kind of a deal with each other, and you get this and I get that, and then we'll get enough people to agree to this overall budget. You don't have any of that because everybody's just kind of throwing the money where they want. There's no incentive for anybody to negotiate with each other. There's some persuasion that happens, but there's no actual deadlock. It will always get funded out. They don't have to come to a compromise position. The compromise position is inherent in the individual choices of all the people contributing money. There's a few, I'm not sure. I don't know if these are benefits or not. They're just interesting. So it allows for funding throughout the year instead of only at a budget time because people can kind of make these donations whenever. So if, say, NASA, we really need first quarter money, right? We want our money in the first, public, please, all our faithful NASA supporters come support us now. They could do this. There's a little more flexibility that way. But that could also be kind of chaotic. Government agencies would have to spend money on advertising to try and get people to give them money, and that could be kind of counterproductive. But on the other hand, it means government agencies are responsible to public interests and needs. They're communicating directly with the public, which is a lot better connection between government and people. So that's kind of kind of goes both ways. And then finally, will government employees just fund their own agencies? Like I get paid by the CIA, so I'm going to give my tax money to the CIA. I don't know if that's good or bad or what, but it's an interesting outcome my wife pointed out to me. So, and then a specific benefit to doing as a credit. A lot of people talk about this and they're like, well, you get your tax form and you fill out where you want your money to go. I find that to be too complicated. It makes tax time more complicated, which is not much fun. And also the credits allow for brokers, this idea that, because it's hard for an individual to say, well, I know that a lot of government agencies need my money and I have to spread it out. They want to be responsible, but it's really hard for any individual to do. So this system of receipts allows a broker to kind of set up packages and a system for doing it that way. So it's a lot more organic. And you can pay at any time, so you don't have to pay your money at tax time. You kind of pay it whenever you have your money throughout the year. So that could be a little nicer. And it's a little more flexible, just allows for a wider range of mechanisms to implement it. So there we go. That's my presentation.
All right. Okay. I'll provide a series of arguments to the contrary, and I'll integrate some rebuttal throughout. So I think the first thing to identify is that what we're talking about here with taxation is that when you create a state, there are some basic mechanics it has to fulfill. The first of which is the aggregate will of the people, and the second is that it has to be fair in its application of doing so. Now, your implicit counterclaim to this is that individuals should have a greater say in the way in which their money has been advocated. I think that say is actually already met in a number of ways. The first way for that is that they get to vote. So they get to vote for the politician who would fund the things that they would want to do. That is to say that a lot of politicians run for certain policies and then implement those policies. And now it's important to note that in your counter proposal, you would have like the libertarian group who would, take their money and then distribute the money in the way that they like. That to me seems like exactly the same function as just simply voting for the libertarian politician or the democratic politician and then just allowing those policies to exact. And now of course, your next claim there is to say, well, there's less negotiation. But of course, if your libertarian like little group you gave your money to has a difference of opinion with you because it has to aggregate the opinions of all the people around it, there's still going to be negotiations there. It's unclear how that's a benefit. And also with the other 95% or 80%, depending on the phase-in stage, there's still going to be negotiations. Secondly, you have the opportunity to campaign in those circumstances, so it's unclear how you don't get your voice heard. Your claim is to say, well, other people make the opinions for you, but that's the point of the state. You outsource some of your responsibility towards them in your vote, and then that's how you get your say there, and then they act on your behalf. And if they're not acting in the way in which you would like, you would vote them out immediately. Or if you try to vote them out and they do not get voted out, that is evidence of you being a minority within that country or electorate or something like that. And that is a reason to believe that the majority of people think that the funding should go otherwise. Similarly, when you say you could pay any time, I'm sure other tax systems could include that as well. What I think, though, is that what this does is it represents an outsourcing of the obligation of the government that's pretty bad. Firstly, it vests power in individuals who have significantly more wealth to control politics in ways that they didn't already have. So you identified some variants of this, for example, people working for the CIA and then paying the CIA. I think more what it looks like is that if you have a specific political persuasion, you would put a lot of your money, like it starts off 5%, which sounds pretty small, but 5% of the American budget is pretty big. And assuming it did get phased in, that would give increasingly more power to people who are wealthy in the way in which they would be applying their funds. So a good example of that is just like increased funding for the military, which may or may not be good for the state, but an individual has nowhere near enough, A, the information to do this, and B, the capacity to comprehend the effects that increase of funding would have. So that is to say is that a politician has lots of information. They have advisors around them all the time telling them things. An individual voter does not. That is why we outsource that responsibility to a person who has the time and the information, the expertise to make those decisions. So that's firstly an inherent harm I think is bad. Secondly, I think the decisions that would be made as a function of this are not necessarily going to be good. So the first reason for that is the reason I just gave about information asymmetry. But secondly, the premise of the case is that the funding would change, by 5% or 10%, however much it is. Now I think what that does is it's moving away from what the state has identified to be the aggregate allocation of resources. That is to say that some things that would have been resourced are now no longer being resourced in favor of other things. And that is, when the state aggregates things, it's not about what every single person wants, but what every single group needs. So, for example, if there are a group of people who are politically disempowered, they are less likely to be voted for, but the state still provides services for them anyway. Under your side, they're less likely to get those services. Thirdly, I think that the funding is likely to be asymmetric. So as I identified before, the people who pay the most tax, as you say, it's proportional to the tax that you would get, are also then going to get significantly more power in the way in which that money is going. And I think there's a differential interest in the people who are making these tax deductions. So, for example, the type of person who's in a low socioeconomic status is more likely to need government services. An example of that might be Planned Parenthood for sex education or condoms and stuff like that. Or just even things like state schools, I think is probably the more reasonable example. Now, these are the people who have less money to donate to any specific organization by the state that would help them. And under your world, the richer people are not going to be having their funds diverted to that specific circumstance there. So I think it's likely to result in a decrease in the types of things that are occurring there. Your claim at this point is to say, well, people don't want their tax dollars going to things that they would otherwise not want them to go to. As I already identified, there's a vote, but once your money goes into the tax office, it's kind of not your money anymore. It's unclear whose dollar is whose. Whereas, and under your side, I think that there's a very likely chance that there are services that are underfunded, and on my side, I make them funded. Fourthly, I think what this results in is that a damaging political narrative about the way in which funds are allocated. So it's to say that, well, if you want some government service, why don't you just pay for it yourself? Why don't you just put your tax dollars into that, because we shouldn't have to pay for it ourselves? And that's pretty bad for a number of reasons. Firstly, for the asymmetry of power I already identified in terms of wealth. Secondly, I think that the remaining government funds, so say the 95% or the 80% of funds that are actually the government does get to aggregate, I think in your world, they are less likely to go to the types of institutions that isn't needed. So, for example, I think of the remaining 95%, that's less likely to go to state schools. One, because that is something that a group of people, a group of very powerful people, presumably because they have the most money, do not want. And therefore, it's likely to be seen as something that is like less important or not politically palatable to do. So they're less likely to get re-elected. And secondly, I think it's obviously there are less politically powerful demographics, so there's no real reason to play to them. And also thirdly, there's less net government cash in order to do it. So they would have to re-aggregate things I think would like to be re-aggregated in bad ways. The final response I have is with regard to corruption. Obviously that corruption is likely going to get worse under your side of the house because you have specific institutions who are barracking for money from the public as opposed to like just getting it from the government. And when the government gives you a set of money, that is your budget for the year. And if there's a discrepancy with that in the expenses when they balance the books at the end of the financial year, that's going to be very obvious. But when you have separated like cash flows coming in from various sources, it's really unclear who's like what money is used. Have they been overfunded? Have they been underfunded? And I think, and especially since it's done is done piecewise, as you identified, it could be done at any point in the year. That means for some periods of the year there could be simply not enough money to fund the services that are required, and I think that's bad. And I lied before when I said that was the last thing. I've actually got one more thing. I think it's like no one's going to fund the tax office under your side. Like who's going to put their money into the Department of Motor Vehicles? Or like things that are shit and no one likes but are necessary for the function of the state. I don't think they're ever going to be done. So I'll stop talking now and let you have a go.
Okay, cool. No, that's a great list. Like I said, part of my goal here is to try and uncover some of the ideas that against it. You've done some really insightful ones, some of which I thought of and a couple of which I haven't. So that's pretty good. So let me go down and just see what I can do to respond to some of these. Some of them I'm not sure I have a rebuttal for, but and since I don't have to win, I don't need one. But
no, everything is winning.
We'll go through. I know it's a little bit of a different game, but it's cool. I still like the challenge, right? So first of all, and I may paraphrase these well, I may paraphrase them poorly just due to my note taking. Creating a state. So creating a state, basic requirements where we need to make. Oh, right. You were talking about the basic requirements of the state already met. They get to vote. Right. So you're saying that people already have choice and influence through their elected officials. I agree with that. Although the perception in America, half the time, most of the people I talk to is like all the officials are corrupt. Everybody's on the take. Everybody's a bad guy. They all have special interests at heart. They just like rich people. They just like poor people. They just want to be in office in order to make money. It's very cynical. I don't personally take that view necessarily. I've known a lot of elected officials, and I find them to be generally pretty genuine people. They actually, more than anything, get corrupted by the pressure of the voting public to tell them to do contrary things like lower my taxes and give me more services at the same time, right? That's the stuff that I see really corrupting public officials. But at any rate, there's a broad perception that they are crooked and that they do not represent the interests of the public. And people in America, I think, are looking specifically for a little more direct control, a little more direct democracy in many cases. And that may not be true of our political spirit. It's always been a Republican spirit where we elect people to do things, but I think people want to move in that direction, and this is kind of a proposal to try and give them that outlet.
So, Matt,
in some cases, people... yeah, sure.
That feeling that you think people have, does that happen more towards the middle of a term or at the ends of a term?
That's interesting. They seem to instantly think everybody but the person they voted for is totally corrupt.
Yeah,
right.
Not just that.
The rest of my representative, right? He's a good guy.
Yeah,
but everybody else, it's. I'm not saying it's a rational thing, but it kind of exists. There are politicians who go down with all kinds of corruption, right? So it does happen for sure. So there's just that feeling in America, right? That we want a little more direct control. One of the reasons you saw Trump get elected is like he's not like those other guys. He's a different kind of a guy. He's a businessman. He's not going to cheat and lie to us. I don't understand that logic, but that's the logic, right?
In the US, on your Senate ballots, I don't know how it works in the US, but in Australia, on the Senate ballots, you have options to vote above or below the line. If you vote above the line, you simply tick for the party and they allocate your votes based on that preference. Or you can...
we don't have that.
Well, in Australia, you can pick which person you want and preference them, or you can just take the party's preferences. And in Australia, most people vote above the line. because they simply don't have time, or they simply don't care, or they don't have the information to vote for the people below the line. And I think what that telling is like, it's pretty simple to like vote for a person. Imagine how much harder it would be to allocate the resources of the government. And I think there's an information disparity, which means that they probably won't do it.
Yeah, quite possibly, and that brings us to this whole broker thing, right? Because my idea of these brokers is a sort of response to that, and I think the next one says, isn't it the same as elected representatives to give money to these brokers who are going to do the allocation? I think there are some distinctions there for sure. The idea of the brokers is still, as the person who's spending money, there'd probably be a lot of these.
Oh, you just cut out. I don't know if you can still hear me, or I definitely can't hear you. Might just refresh the page.
Start the debate as things fucked up.
All right. Hey,
yeah. Hello? Oh, it worked that time. Well, that was terrible.
Yeah, it looks like we lost everything we just said.
I'm guessing so. That's pretty rotten. Lame. You know what? Like, I'm just, because I'm enjoying the conversation, I'm inclined to go on, and then this will just be a rotten video. So be it, right? We know what's happening. All right, for those listening at home, we're discussing U.S. government tax credits, a system by where people can voluntarily give money to the government to choose where the tax money goes. So we're going over a long list of his very thoughtful objections to it. And you probably don't watch this because you missed the whole context. But anyway, so we were talking about the brokers here, and brokers are basically my idea that organizations can help people direct their tax money in a more thoughtful way, because it's very hard for individuals to figure out where they want all their money to go. Now, some people are just going to be like, I want all my money to go to the military, and fine by that, right? Okay, great, you can do that. But if they want something a little more nuanced, then they can ask. And the Republican or Democratic Party could do this. They could say, like, if you donate money through us, we'll make sure it goes to what the Democrats think are the best ideas. So people could do that if they want to. So it's a little bit different from an elected representative, because in the U.S. system, an elected representative has to win a majority vote, or at least a plurality vote, but usually it's a majority because we have runoffs to get two candidates. So the idea that this is different is because it doesn't require that 50% margin. You know, you can just, there could be one guy in Iowa who has his special, like, Iowan Potatoes for Life fund, and you can direct your money through him if you want to. He doesn't need to win an election. So that's a problem we have in America, like third parties and kind of minority viewpoints, like radical Christians and stuff. They don't get political representation because they can never achieve a 50% majority. But this way, they have actually some voice that doesn't have to go through that rubric and meet that threshold in order to have an impact. This is a small impact, because will their one donation really make a huge difference in the budgets? No, but it makes some impact, right? Some tiny impact. And so they get that at least, instead of none, which is how much they normally are afforded.
But the logical extension of that is that if there are people who are willing to do this, for example, the Iowan Potato Fellow, I mean, there are likely to be more of them. And if it's a good policy, it has to be applicable to a lot of people doing it. And if, as you say earlier, before we cut out, that there is a large number of people in America who are feeling discontented with their politician, even if that discontent is justified or not, they still feel it. They're likely to act on this policy, and then they're likely to distort the government funds in a way in which are probably pretty bad.
I agree. Yeah, that's a real possibility. And I agree with that. And, you know, that's one of the points I have too, right? If people can make terrible decisions, we can end up with something wretched. I do, you know, I was talking earlier a little bit about that penny thing. There's a kind of aggregate intelligence, though, that can happen because there's so many different viewpoints. I mean, most Americans, a lot of Americans are pretty responsible people, and they, you know, they live their lives and they raise their families and all that. So they don't necessarily have terrible views. And in aggregate, you know, I travel around the country. I meet people in the rural areas, and it's helped me understand Republican voters in my country. I'm not usually one. I come from an urban area. I have city interests and city thoughts. We all live in close proximity. We got to cooperate well for any of this stuff to work. You live out in the country, people are telling you to cooperate. You're like, cooperate with who? Look on the horizon. Do you see anyone else here? No, this is my farm. I do things the way I want. I'm tired of all these stupid rules that got nothing to do with anybody else, right? So you see this kind of different perspective. Are the city people right or are the country people right? Well, they're both right. They're right for different circumstances, right? The way our political system works is like one guy wins, one guy, the city guy, if the urban candidate gets elected, well, the rural guy's got nothing to say. If the rural guy gets elected, the city guy's got nothing to say. But under this system, the city guy has some influence and the rural guy has some influence. And they're both going to, you know, the rural guy's going to direct money towards things that are actually going to benefit rural guys. And the city guys are going to direct money towards things that are going to help city guys. So in a sense, the diversity of perspectives is going to meld together and create, I think, maybe in some cases, wiser decisions than we have just by individuals who have a limited perspective on what's good or what's bad and have to make atomic choices rather than graduated choices. So I think it brings a new kind of thinking.
And I think that's the problem, because the argument that you've made is not an objection to the way in which tax policy works. It's an objection to having to aggregate any of your control to the state. Now, I mean, this debate or discussion operates in the circumstance in which a state still exists. If you take the logical extension of your arguments, well, there shouldn't be a state because the
Maybe
state...
so.
Well, yeah, well, perhaps because the state requires the acquiescence of control and then aggregates it out to other individuals who have less control. And I think that we strike a middle ground right now. That is to say, you talk about the rural guy and the city guy, but there's a rural electorate and a city electorate, both of which get elected representatives who then get to go and talk to their various councils and advocate for you on your behalf. And sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. If the averages argument is correct, then the averages argument is also correct across time, because sometimes Republicans are in power and sometimes the Democrats are in power. That would also like even out over time to the median decision that ought best be made.
Maybe. I think the problem is, you know, you have different kinds of legislative activities. I think this is interesting. There's parallels here. So you have lawmaking, right? Murder is legal. We're not going to, you know, we're going to set immigration limits. We're going to do all these kinds of things, right? Those are atomic decisions. You can't sort of have a compromise. You know, I mean, you can make compromises, but you can't have a thing that says a little of this, a little of that, a little of those. You have to make a firm, exact, specific decision. In those cases, representative systems are really good because you've got one person who's going to try to make the best judgment they can. You know, there's some negotiations and stuff, but you're going to come to a single decision. Budgets, the way they work, they have gradient levels, right? So it's not fund, defund, it's how much funding. So there's a range you can get, and so you can have a decision-making process that's based on many atomic interests in aggregate. As where if you're deciding whether murder should be legal or not, there's only one choice. You can't make an aggregate choice. So it's just not really an option. And I think it's interesting to explore the space in which, and I think there could be some benefit to it, where people are allowed to make graduated decision-making and have that kind of activity. I can't say, you know, with certainty that that's going to come out great, but this is a thought experiment more than anything else, right? But I think there really could be value. I've seen that in other situations in game theory. I'm a game strategist. I love to play games. And there's a thing on the internet where what people do is they play games in a group. So they're going to say, all right, here's the next turn in this strategy game. Everybody on a forum board gets together and votes. And then they do what the aggregate decision is, right? And in certain kinds of games, there's, you know, allocate. Yeah, it's interesting. And so they play these games, and the strategy of these group minds is actually incredibly good in a lot of cases. It's a really powerful tool. It's a lot better than a single individual making a given decision, because you get a huge range of perspectives and knowledge input into the data. right? And I just feel like there's some potential for that in budgetary decisions that we've, because of our traditional thinking, just the way we've always done things, we've never tried it. It's a little harder without the information age to accumulate this kind of information and do these kinds of activities. But I think as we get into new technology, new ways to communicate, it opens the door. And I really feel like there's a, if you don't try it, you're never going to know. I think there's a good possibility that it could be useful and powerful.
So I think in terms of the perspectives and knowledge, you already get that right now when you vote for your politician. That is that we've both described systems of aggregation. Mine is a system of aggregation that takes into account those voices that are not heard in the direct aggregation. So what I mean by that is say you have a population of 10 people, a population of a country that's 10, 7 of them are purple and 3 of them are yellow. And the yellow ones are pretty disenfranchised. They're pretty poor. They don't have very good jobs. And as a consequence, they pay very little or no tax. In your world, politicians have very little incentive to advocate for the yellow guys because all of the government funding, over 70% of it, because presumably the yellow guys don't pay as much tax, will go to institutions that the purple guys want. You need a state that's going to say, nah, we need to aggregate money in a way in which is best for the majority, as opposed to what atomized individuals want. And that is the logical extension of what your claim is that individuals who have money should be able to spend it where they like. They can spend that money wherever they like at any time. For example, there's nothing stopping you from donating cash to a government institution. And I mean, obviously that's still subject to corruption and stuff like that. But the important thing is that there's a portion of money that's sequestered away that the government has control of and can aggregate the power of. Secondly, I think there's a little bit of perspective loss under your side, because as I identified earlier in the previous speeches, which have been deleted, the people who you elect in an electoral system are ones who have advisors around them, have information from different interest groups, and they themselves have to aggregate the interest groups. Now, I think that's information that you probably lose in the extension of 80 and then 70 and then 60%. But regardless, the claim that there's this group intelligence that they just kind of average out to the answer. I've Googled the penny thing a couple of times. I found a couple of ones, experiments on it, where the average and the median and the guess were pretty different. But assuming that it is, I mean, it's really unclear why people with insufficient information are going to aggregate out in that way. So, for example, when you're guessing pennies, all you need to know is the size of the penny and how and the size of the jar, and then just kind of guess it from there. Whereas this, you have to know. Math, yeah. Well, yeah, you have the size of the government and then the different systems and stuff like that. So it's not just a lack of information because it's so big, it's really hard for anyone to comprehend, but there's also individual incentives which change the way in which you're acting. So for example, your incentive with the penny is to pick the best amount, and then you're going to try and guess the best amount. But as I identified in the previous speeches, no one wants to fucking fund. No one, I don't know how swearing is.
That's fine. You're welcome. You can do it.
No one wants to fund the ATO or the Australian Tax Office or the tolls, So I think that not only is it just a bit of group intelligence doesn't work as a lack of information, even if there was information, because, it could give that information to them, the incentives that act upon them mean that they're not going to pick the best situation.
I think that's a great argument, right? That last one, and that was kind of the last one from the speech that we deleted. Somehow was that people are not going to fund the tax office, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. No, they're not going to do that. Now maybe of course, maybe we get rid of the tax office. Right, this is the way to get rid of the tax office. They don't need funding anymore because we're just going to allocate it ourselves, right? I suppose that if this was a hard debate, that would probably be the best response. But I'm going to say no. Yeah, I think there's definitely a point to that. And I would worry that you just unknown offices of the government that people don't understand what they do, but they do something useful. We clean the trichinosis out of the water supply. It's kind of a good idea, but we're not real sexy and nobody knows about it, right? I guess the response would be those guys would have to speak up. There would have to be a mechanism by which they survive, and that's why you would scale these things in. It would actually bring people a better understanding of what happens in government and why you need to have broader funding. I think at first people would be kind of yahoos about this and they just put all their money in one basket. But pretty soon they're going to start to, as things break, you start to understand that maybe this isn't a great idea. And a little bit more wisdom comes back into the process. And then you have a wisdom plus this choice. And I said, this broker system is kind of part of that. So the people who are already in politics would form the foundation. I bet a lot of people would just fund their money through the Republican or Democratic Party or whatever parties there happen to be. Yeah. And a lot of stuff would, and maybe nothing would change, right?
Yeah.
But then again, also you still, even if you do that, you don't have to have this argument, these huge fights between the Republicans and the Democrats. They just bark for the public interest, and then they fund their money where they fund it. They don't have to fight each other over it, right? They can go fight over the laws, but they don't have to fight over the funding as much. So it just creates less of this conflict. So, I mean, it's definitely a downside for sure, and a problem that you would have to overcome in a system like this. I don't think it's an insurmountable problem, but it's definitely one that would cause a lot of and it could lead, the trichinosis outbreak could happen because somebody forgot to fund those guys, right? And that's terrible. But that's why I would phase in. And another way I've proposed this before is that you reserve a certain amount of money. So like half the tax money is going to go towards these things that the politicians have decided we're not going to entrust the public to make the following decisions, right? But then after that, whether you want more NASA or you want more, V5 rockets, that's your choice, right? We get to decide that, but you don't get to decide whether there's a Coast Guard or a CDC or something funded at least to some minimal levels, where that they can function, but maybe the life is not going to be as good as it would be. I don't know. Those are some ways that you can compromise the system in order to try and adjust for that, so that you get some of the benefits, some of the not benefits.
I've got a couple of responses to that if you want to.
Yeah, go for it.
So the first is that the argument that things break is probably a bad argument. Like we don't know whether or not the policy is good, so we're just going to put it in and see if it screws things up, and then that's a joke. I think the thing about the 50%, and this is something that some amount that's still sequestered away from government control, is something I mentioned in the previous speeches. Is one, if the problem is that people aren't having enough control, this is still a limit on their controls, and they're still going to end up grumpy that the politicians are, they're corrupt, so the problem still starts again. So it maybe it takes like 10 to 15 years, but then that becomes the new standard, and you're likely to keep pushing it forward. And secondly, well, part of it, yeah. And secondly, the reasons that I outlined earlier, that this 50% is unlikely to go to those underfunded things. So the example is state schools, and the reasoning I gave before for those watching is that this is now a political system that more heavily preferences those who are wealthy, because those are the ones who control government institutions. And as a function of that, they're less likely to fund things like state schools, because those are the individuals who have not been able to fund it themselves, probably because they're in a low SES environment. And as a function of that, those systems probably decrease because it's not politically palatable to give money to those individuals. That's the trade-off governments need to make, and that's the thing I think is harmful. But aside from how this would play out, because I agree, there are probably some safeguards you can put in. It's probably unfair of me to push you on very specific details. So perhaps something that's more reasonable for us to talk about is the political narratives that are likely to be born out of this. And I think there are two pretty strong ones. The first of which I said earlier, which was to say that it creates the narrative that if you want something, that you should just go and fund it yourself because it's not the government's responsibility, or that if you wanted to have more political power, you should have just put money into your state school. And that's got very obvious rebuttals to a reasonable person. But you've got to remember, in the political sphere, when everyone's always at odds and they think the other side is corrupt, that is not the logic that's going to prevail. And secondly, and this is kind of a response to what you said before about people caring about how the government functions. For example, if you're putting money into like the FBI and the CIA, I think what that does is it gives greater license for individuals to demand the freedom of information and transparency in those organizations. And I think that transparency is probably, could be good or bad, but these like international intelligence organizations require secrecy to function as an unfortunate truth that it is. And I think that the political narrative that's likely to be born out of this is that, well, we demand information. Not only is it like we pay your salaries, but we actually pay your salaries. We actually gave it to you.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's likely to be damaging for the functioning of those. Similarly, like things like police as well, on a small scale, it is likely to occur in the same way.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, for better or for worse, you're giving the public of the United States or whatever country more power over the government, the ability to pull the purse strings and control a little bit more what's going on. That could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. I guess it depends on what you think the judgment of the average taxpayer is, whether it's good or bad, or the judgment that they've trusted to other people through the brokers, whether that's good or bad. I'm a kind of an optimistic guy, right? So I tend to feel that we want to trust people and we want a little bit more direct control. I do want the CIA to be a little more forthcoming with what they do or not doing. You know, I don't want the list of the names of spies, but I would like to know if you're tapping my phone or not, you know, that kind of thing. So I actually see that as a potential positive as well. I want to speak to what you're talking about as though it gives more power to wealthy people, because that's not one of the disadvantages I had. I think it's perceptive and it makes a lot of sense. The only response I can offer is, I think so far, is that that's already largely the case. Rich people already control the political donations that drive the politicians and the election processes. While this gives more power away from, like, it becomes a kind of proportional vote, but that's already there to some extent. And also, even though it's already there, there's a lot of wealthy people in the United States that are very interested in helping the homeless and in feeding the poor and in creating social programs. Most of those programs are not driven from the grassroots up by actual poor people demanding them. They come from rich people who think that we should provide those services to the rest of society. And I think that will continue. There will be plenty of rich people who will fund their money towards philanthropic efforts rather than to themselves, because they have a sense of what is a good society or what's not. Now, the libertarian ones, probably not so much, because they would like the money just to be of their own. But the more socially minded, which there are plenty of, will generate their money off in that direction rather than just pure self-interest. So I recognize it as a problem. I think you're right, but I think it is mitigated somewhat by those factors.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Cool. So on rich people, you say the claim that you make is that they already have a significant control in the political system, and this isn't much different. I mean, imagine I swapped out the words "rich people" for North Korea and power in the political system for nuclear weapons. You wouldn't be like, they've already got it, you know, it's okay. Like, obviously, when you're implementing government policies, things could always get significantly worse, and there's no reason to make those things worse. Yes. Secondly, you say that whether or not you think it's the average taxpayer who's making those good decisions, I think that they probably won't, because of the information and the time and the care and the political incentives that I spoke about before, which are distinct from what you would see in a penny. But I think there's just like an intuition pump that you could do to see whether or not that's good. And the question is, think of a person with who you think has an average IQ, right? And then just realize that the 50% of people are dumber than that person. So I think it's instructive to demonstrate that people are really bad at making decisions. For example, they don't save when they're young, or they impulse spend, or they just say things without thinking. That is the way in which people operate, because they're messy and terrible and awful. But it's great that we're human. The thing is that if you can aggregate that in a formalized system, those problems are likely to go away. Your final claim is to say, well, rich individuals are the ones that provide the social good services, for example, like soup kitchens and stuff. One, I don't think that you can always rely on that. So that is to say, if you think to like any other society in history, like imagine like aristocratic societies in England, right? They were pretty cruel to the poor, and there's no reason to believe that feeling might not return or come back. So it's very likely to be cyclical. But secondly, the argument I made in my previous speech, which I think is the stronger response to this, is that the government has an obligation to protect people. That's the point of the state's inception, and it should not outsource that obligation. It would be like, okay, a good example of a reason where they shouldn't outsource it is our prisons. I know there are some privatized prisons in America, but and not to devolve into that debate, but I think if you look at the principle of it, it seems pretty silly that the government should be able to outsource control of other human beings to a private company. In fact, a better example is the police. We give the state the monopoly on power because it makes the rest of society safer. Imagine if that was like a private company, how like really messy that would be if they were the ones who had like a police force that could run around and enforce laws.
RoboCop. That's what that is.
So I think and before I'll pass over in a sec, but I think that the conclusion of that is that the government has an obligation to fix problems where they exist, and they ought not outsource that obligation. If you implement this system, it means that they're less likely to adhere to that obligation because it just imparts it onto the people, like the rich people, for example. And I think that's probably pretty wrong.
Well, I think there's a hybrid here because it's still the government that's making the operations and running the institutions, right? One of the reasons, a libertarian would take a view as to like, Sig, why are you doing this crazy system? Just get rid of the government, right? Get rid of all these institutions and let private people make their own decisions, right? And I think there's a couple responses to that. Not that you brought that up, but I think it is important to bring up, which is that it's still the government that's doing the regulations, pursuing the interest in the public interest rather than as a profit motive, right? So you still have that. We're just talking about like what level of funding they have, like what amount of mandate they have to carry out their mission, right? It determines how effective they can be rather than whether or not they're going to make an honest attempt at providing these services, right? So if the police are funded in a more voluntary system, it's a question of how many police do we need out on the street, not what policies are the police officers following. It's true that the public would have a little more direct influence. The police maybe would adopt a new policy and the public loves it. And so they respond their love by funding the police a little bit better. So you could see some influence if the public doesn't like a certain littering law or something, that could be expressed in the ability to enforce it. But again, I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing because generally the public doesn't like littering, but so they're going to make those decisions, and they're probably not going to be really stupid. So I don't know. It's more indirect control. It's not taking it out of the hands of the public institutions or out of the hands of the government. It's just deciding more how much of that you want in your society, right? And it could be more, right? I think it's very possible that certain underfunded ideas in government that rarely get funding because they're not politically sexy or they don't have a big public interest could actually, get a big chunk of money from a certain group of very wealthy people who are really intent on seeing that change in society. So it allows for more flexibility. Maybe it's a problem, but maybe it's not a problem, right? Like maybe we're ignoring these things,
I mean, imagine if you just gave any group the power, like regardless of whether or not they're rich or poor, whether or not they've earned it or not, whether or not it's racist or sexist or any other ism you can think of, just an or more amorphous group of people who have a political persuasion, and as a function of that, we're just able to drastically change in which the government worked. I mean, that to me seems highly anti-democratic and highly anti the choice of all the other people. Like, because importantly, like, I think you really need to look at the impact that this would have. Your claim is that what we're actually talking about is the level of funding that things have and how effective that those institutions can work. There's quite a bit of distrust, or not distrust, disdain for things like state schools, of people who don't send their kids to state schools because they see it as a waste of money. A better example in the US is Planned Parenthood. Without these institutions, like, people are more likely just to die of HIV and AIDS because they can't get access to condoms or free sexual health advice. Without state schools, that would just, the state schools would probably still exist, but they wouldn't be as effective. That probably means that the widens the gap between those who are educated in state schools and non-state schools. That to me seems really unfair and really bad. I think the better claim you make is to say, well, there's a, and I don't want to sound like I'm confrontational. This is just kind of like the
no, that's fine.
Default mode. Is to say, well, this is good because it expresses the will. For example, you could fund things less like a littering law, and then you say, well, littering law is pretty silly. Yeah, I agree. Just say, I'll say like some amorphous law that they want to have their voice heard on. The question is why can't that occur in voting or protests or writing letters to your local member? And even if it can't, I think the important thing to note is that when my money, say you and I were talking about funding the police, and I fund the police less because I don't like some amorphous law and this is my form of protest, and you fund the police less because you don't think the police should exist, or you think the police are racist, and then you do those things. And then we've both spent less money, but there's no way for the government to infer what that thing was. Like, why is it that these people stopped spending money? And I think what that does is it leads them to need to make guesses about what the people want, as opposed to a more aggregated system where you vote and you can write to your elected official and they can advocate for you on your behalf. So I identify... And this is also true for all other things, like you said at the start. I identify that it is an expression of personal will it's unclear if that expression of personal will translates to the policy or governmental changes that will would dictate. I think that's the question I have.
It's a good examination. I think that, again, we kind of run into a situation where it's not necessarily a lot different than what we already have. Politicians don't always know why they get votes or why they don't get votes. They don't have interaction with all the direct voters, just like you wouldn't in this situation. Although, you certainly could institute a system where when you donate your money, you can add a message to it that say why. And then that could get aggregated by a computer, and it could say, 15,000 people said they don't like the littering law or whatever it is, right? So you could add in that kind of a system to it. Of course, you could also add in that kind of a system to voting, and there are mechanisms where you can definitely make your voice heard to your congressman, et cetera. So I think those things aren't necessarily intrinsically connected one way or another. But it's a good point that just spending your money is not a clear message. It's a little indirect. And it's like advertising, it leaves people guessing a little bit what happened. So you'd have to do some research to find out what's going on. Like companies, of course, private companies are doing this all the time, trying to understand their customers, what they want or what they don't want. It might be nice if more government agencies were thinking along those lines. Might not. It might waste their time, right? It just depends.
Well, I agree that you could probably put in systems like messages on the funding as well, but like you got to look at the comparison between the two. So politicians right now do know, because they run on campaigns and people respond to those campaigns and people write letters. There are ways for people to communicate. If you added in like the message thing and then has a computer aggregated it for the donations, like that just sounds a lot like voting to me, except the difference between this and the current system we have is now, instead of the vote just being something you get because you're of voting age and you're a human and you're not in jail, it's now you get more power because of the wealth that you have. So even if those systems are totally equal, even if you can find a way to make sure that these government institutions get the information so they're not just like stabbing in the dark, now you're just giving more of a voice to those individuals who have more cash. And I think that's pretty bad. So you should just default to the vote, which is, I agree, there are inefficiencies in the system right now, which do privilege those who have significantly more money or like connections in the industry and blah, blah, blah. But that's not a reason to make it worse.
But you still have your vote. I agree. And I argue with people on campaign finance reform sometimes, and they're like, money, money, money. And I'm like, yeah, but look, you can spend all the money in the world unless you're actually bribing me. My vote's my vote, right? Like I can still spend it. And they're like, no, but people are influenced. And I'm like, well, I can't help that, right? People, yes, they get influenced. So no, I agree. I think that's a great criticism. And like I said, it's probably the one that you made that I don't have on my list that's probably most important, is it does create more of an oligarchy society. It is more democratic, but it is also more oligarchic.
Oh no, it's not more democratic. It's not, because it would be more democratic if here's a more democratic version of it, is if say the funds of the US government were $100 billion and they got to allocate them however they liked. It would be more democratic if you gave everyone like a survey and they said gave percentages, because that's something that's inherent to a person, whereas in your world it's the money of which you have. Which I still think would be terrible, absolutely terrible.
I was going to say, it's good, interesting.
But be more democratic.
Yeah, you're right. I absolutely agree with that. That would be a more classically democratic system. I was thinking democratic just in that you have more direct control over government action as an individual. But I agree, that would be even more both democratic and egalitarian at the same time. So I think, democratic is just sort of like a matter of I make a vote and then there's a policy interaction from it, right? And then there's an egalitarian element that says that all of our votes are the same and equal in power.
Yeah.
And those two things can be separated, but traditionally we would think of them as going together. So that is an excellent point. And I think probably the strongest argument against the system, although it also makes for a very interesting critique against libertarian ideas that you just want to hand over functions of charity into the private sector and that it's automatically going to be better. One of the critiques is that you're really handing over all the decisions about that to the wealthy people. course, they'd probably come back and say, yeah, well, the wealthy people have the money, so they should make those decisions. But so it goes. I don't want to make that argument here myself. That's not my game.
No, of course. I do think it's a persuasive argument. I don't think it's the most persuasive one. I think the most persuasive one is that the functioning of the government will be significantly worse. Because I mean, what?
It's a good argument, actually. Yes.
Like, what do you think the reason is? I mean, whether or not you're persuaded or not. What is the reason that the aggregate money that is donated? So say we remove the unfairness of people having more power because they're rich. So we're
voting on priorities. Yeah.
Yeah. Why is it to believe that people are in the best mind to make these decisions?
Okay, so this comes to my personal philosophy a little bit, right? I'm what I would call a liberal-minded person. There was an interesting study recently that looked at people who call themselves liberal, people who call themselves conservative, and what that really represents as an instinct. And what it seems to be is that people who are liberal-minded like change for change's sake. They like to shake up the system. They like to see what happens if I push the shiny red button, right? People who tend to be attracted to a conservative and a traditional mindset like continuity. They like things to stay the same. They like reliability. They want things from today to be similar to tomorrow. That makes them feel safe and good. Mm-hmm. And that these things are actually like hardwires in our brain to an extent. We get endorphins. Conservative people get endorphins when things are the same and stable and reliable. People who are liberal-minded get endorphins when things change, when there's a new dramatic event that happens, and we get excited, right? I'm definitely in that liberal category. I love to shake up the system and see what happens. I love to play with the levers. My rationale is we get to find out new information, and we can take that new information and we can do better than we did before, right? The safe stated thing is nice, but you never improve. You don't adapt. You don't get better, right? So you need, and my theory is in human society, you need both of these people, right? If you have all the chaotic people like me, madness reigns, right? If you have all the stable, nothing ever changes, everybody dies out when the environment changes the next time and nobody can adapt to it. So you need both of these people rattling around. My interest in this subject probably comes partly from my inclination to try experiments and to see whether they work or not. And then once we've changed them, I wouldn't be like, no, we have to have the system no matter how terrifying it is. No. If people make incredibly bad decisions and it screws everything up, let's stop, right? And that's why I would normally say, let's start with like 5%. Let's see what happens. Let's find out if people are making good decisions or bad decisions, and then we go forward from there. I agree. That's my instinct.
I agree. If you implement a policy that's bad, then you should definitely revert the policy. But that's not an argument to implement any policy. You have to sit down and think about what are the outcomes of that policy. And if you think it's likely to have a good outcome or reasonable odds to have a good outcome, perhaps that's a reason to start fiddling with the levers. To use the North Korea example again, it'd be like, I just wonder what would happen if we... what if we just fired at them and just see what they know? You've got to use the information that you have at your disposal to decide.
I agree.
And I think that incidentally, that it's the average voter's lack of information and time scarcity, which means that they're less likely to vote on this in a good way.
I think you're probably right about that. I'm guessing a lot of people, everybody can vote in America in theory. There's problems in some states with voter suppression, things like that, but a lot of people just don't. They just don't care, right? They have no interest in it whatsoever, right? And so they just let other people make the decisions. And I think a lot of people would do that anyway, right? So you get a certain amount of outlet of people who don't care where the taxes go. They're like, I don't understand. That's what I pay you guys for. And they just let the money ride. So I think there's a little bit of a natural safety valve where it's only the kind of people who at least think they're smart who will be trying to second guess the system and play the government stock market, as it were, or however you want to put it, right? Who are really, and there'll be a lot of middle people who are like, the responsible thing to do is to give my money to people I trust and let them allocate it. So they're going to go with their party or whatever broker group they feel most aligned with, and they'll do that. I think that would be the lion's share of people. And then there will just be, it's total guesswork. Yeah, let's do some surveys first, obviously, study this idea before you implement it. But I think then there would be just kind of like a 20% range of people who think they know better and are going to try and allocate that money themselves. A small percentage of them will try to do all the math and figure it out and make the world's best budget according to so-and-so. Others will just be like, I want more space exploration. All my money's going to NASA, right? And then that's the way it works out. I actually think NASA would be a big winner in this program. I think.
Oh, really? I think it would be the opposite.
Yeah, I really do. They're incredibly popular, actually.
Oh, okay.
They're far more popular in the country than they are funded. They have really rabid fans. And, you know, a lot of this idea came from watching things on Kickstarter, right? You're familiar with it, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends in the game industry, and tabletop game industry. And, you know, I watched people who had a game idea and they put it up there and they're like, I need 60 grand in order to make this game. And they got $2.5 million to make a game about exploding kittens, right? You know, and who knew that was a thing everybody wanted? It turns out it was.
Yeah.
So it just sort of shows that possibility, right? That if you unleash people, interesting things will happen.
I agree that you should explore and stuff. I think what you say about most people not caring, I mean, maybe that's a function of the US voting system being voluntary. I mean, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Australia has a compulsory voting system. Shh, don't tell anyone. But regardless, if it is true, like So what I've said so far is, I think is one of the worst outcomes if people start allocating funds in a bad way. Say it's more benign, as you just described, that the lion's share of people just give it to one of these brokers, and then there's a couple of people who go hardcore, but they don't really have enough money to do so anyway. The question I have there then is one, the criteria you set for increasing the system forward is if it works, if there's no harm, we would increase the number, the percentage that is there. And once that percentage reaches a critical mass, you're probably going to think it's a bad idea. And that begs the question, why is it that you would risk worse governmental funds allocation for like the small benefit of like half a dozen people thinking that they have more control in the government? I'm not being told what to do, especially when I identified all the other reasons that they already get some power. It seems to me just to be like I read the topic and I thought it was an interesting idea, but it seems to me just like such a tiny little benefit for potentially quite a large harm.
Well, that would be good to launch into a Siegfried rhetorical flurry then towards the end of this. Yeah. So here's my vision and one of my political ideologies. One of the reasons I'm on QallOut, one of the reasons I like to argue with people. I envision a future society that is less rancorous and acrimonious, in which there are less incentives for us to fight with one another over how things and what kind of outcome we have. Less of a winner-take-all society where only the top 50% vote getter gets to make the decision and only the rich people are allowed to run and make decisions. A society that is a little more synchronous and natural and ebbs and flows based on individual needs and preferences, and just where we have less reason to be fighting with each other and arguing with one another. Where persuasion is not a winner-take-all game, but where persuasion is a move to the left, move to the right. It's more of a wave. It's a sloshy thing. So we can have this argument. There doesn't have to be a winner. We both come out of here with more ideas.
I agree.
We both come out with a deeper understanding of one another and where we're at, because the stakes on the table are not as high, right? We're not in a tournament. It's not a competition. We're not fighting for election, right? So my envision, the thing that is most attractive to me about this is it speaks to a future more nuanced political society that is less about top-down power and a little bit more about a kind of, betray my free market capitalism thing, a little bit more about a market of ideas and a natural outcome of that market that reaches different equilibriums, right? And so it's a blending of some of the things that I think are best about the way organizations work and about how decisions can be made that aren't really part of the political system now that I'd like to see, because I think it creates a more fluid, a more graduated, and a little bit less high stakes area of confrontation. And clearly that doesn't work with North Korea.
Well,
right? But it might work with other things like road building and with ideas that are currently done in a top-down automatic way, but maybe should be done in a little less of a high-stakes scenario. Think like, in America, we can never seem to reduce military funding. We've been on a wartime footing since the 1950s, right? Because nobody's willing to say, Right. You know, we got to protect all the money we have. Is what it's about, right? We're a big target, right?
Yeah,
So we're going to have a lot of guns. There's some logic to it, right? You know, but I'm always like, man, can't we just like walk it back a little? Like just, you know, inch off that. Like nobody has to be like, we hate, you know, weapons, or we hate defending ourselves, or we don't want to be the most powerful people, because who doesn't want to be the most powerful person on the block, right?
Yeah.
But can we just take it back a little and have some different priorities? But nobody is willing to like oppose the military, right? Because if you want to lower their funding, you're bad, you hate the military, right? So I want to find a way to de-escalate these things, to like I said, just take some of those stakes off the table so we can make some decisions without so much judgment going on.
Well, we're about to run out. So I agree that doesn't need to be a win. I had quite a bit of fun, and I really enjoy talking about things, even though it does sound like I'm being aggressive and debatory. That's just the way I like to discuss.
I like the challenge.
Yeah,
that part is good. Yeah.
That said though, just on your vision, earlier in the discussion, you said that you read a study about how those who are conservative versus those who are liberal have like these inherent traits psychologically. For example, the way in which they would envision change. It seems to be, if that's an inherent human thing, that would probably be in tension with your vision of the world. I just, you know, if you have any thoughts about resolving that, might be.
Yeah. I have to persuade more people who like stability and certainty that there is a potential benefit in this chaos. And that's, I guess, why I have that little argument about like, well, let's just try it out. Just a little taste, right? Just the tip. So just a little. You know, and or I would like to see it done as an experiment somewhere where they can do that. You know, there's some of these people that are trying to start up new countries, and those are really interesting to me because people try out new ideas. So maybe that's a way to do some of these things. That's all. You know, just to introduce the ideas and I guess not be too strident about them. That's my other trick.
I think that's very, very reasonable advice. Anyway,
cool. Well.
There you go.
Thanks for the debate. It was great. I think you kind of had the upper hand here because I think my idea is a little crazy. But I appreciate all the challenges and giving me the chance to get my idea out there. So
no problem. I had a great time too. And thank you so much for accepting my challenge. Or like letting me debate you on your challenge. Yeah. Thank you.